I'm going to talk about the origin of life. I have a really big brain, so I'm a really smart person, and I know all sorts of crap. So I'm going to tell you about the origin of life. I did a bit of research on this, and I know everything. And I asked some guy, I said, "How did life begin on planet Earth?" And the guy responded. This was on a public forum. I didn't like ask a random guy on the street. And it was on some sort of a science forum with a lot of biological nerds. And he said something like a protein needs to be surrounded by a cell wall in order for life to begin. And if you search for it on Google, you will confirm that not anyone has ever said that before, except for this one guy. So, they have other, you could look it up on Google. You can see what Google says, which is, of course, always the truth. People have different ideas. I'm just telling you what one guy told me. So there's this book that has all this scientific information, and it's called the Bible. And there's something called Genesis, which explains in scientific matters how life began. And then you've got this Wikipedia page. I don't know if it's evolution, history of the Earth, or something like that. So I went and I read both. In Genesis, it says like there was no light. There was the earth. There was dust everywhere, and then the dust settled, and then there was light, and then there was the water formed on the earth, and then the mammals climbed out of the water onto the land, and then humans started doing stuff. And I'm looking at the Wikipedia page about the history of the earth, and guess what? It was nearly identical to what the Bible said. I know you're going to say that's not true. Absolutely, it was true. So I'm going to go through what scientists say. They say that there was a cloud of dust, and gravity pulls it together, and it becomes like like a baseball, and it becomes more dense, and it attracts more dust, and it builds up over time, and you know other objects, they gravitate towards it, and it forms a greater mass with greater gravity, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you have a planet. And when the planet starts, there's dust everywhere. Like Jupiter is a giant dust storm, and the dust hasn't settled. Once it settles, it. Think about the thingy that makes all different things separate based on their mass. I forgot what it's called. Cyclotron. I don't even remember what it's called. You know what I'm talking about. The device where they spin it and it separates everything based on its mass. So the water is going to form probably near the ground because of gravity. The air is going to probably form above the ground also because of gravity. Now keep in mind that just like you can be buoyant in the water like a scuba diver, can you tell I go scuba diving? You can also be buoyant in the air and probably buoyant in the ground too. So the water forms, but that's not life. Life, what's the definition of life? Life consumes food and a fuel such as oxygen. It engages in cell division, and it has a birth period, a growth period, and it dies. That's the definition of life. That's the facts of life. Okay, Tootie. So how do you make that happen? You get the protein in the cell wall. Obviously, it's going to happen in the ocean. So I'm going to tell you right now, dinosaurs didn't just plop on the earth. You start as something called a single cell organism, or something even less than that. And certain types of life, you've got plant life, you've got mammals, you've got birds, you've got fish, you've got insects, you've got worms. Some are a little bit more complicated. For example, everybody knows that insects are, okay, humans are advanced. We're super advanced. We know everything more than anybody else in the universe. Plants are kind of dumb. So the issue with plants is that plants, they don't need to seek out food. They can't move. They don't have to go seek out water. The water kind of comes to them. You know what I mean? The water comes to them. They get the food from the soil. you can kind of see how it would be easy for a blade of grass to go through a growth period. It doesn't need a lot from its environment. Like a fish is in the water, fish needs to eat food, which is going to be another fish that's smaller than it. So what does the small fish eat? The small fish eats plankton, and I believe that plankton are the animals in the water that don't have mobility. They just kind of float around. And what do plankton eat? They probably absorb light, and they do cell kinesis, which is a scientific word. You look it up. And it's the same with the plants. Plants are relatively simple life forms, like a blade of grass. So it's easy to put a plant somewhere and expect it's going to survive. Different with a human. A human's got to go seek out its food, got to seek out the water, might have to build shelter, has to eat a lot of food. The plant's probably got a better chance of surviving than a human does. So what happens is you go to the more simple life forms. Does it make sense for life to begin in the water? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But the simple life forms are that it's easier for a plant to come out of the ocean and then become a life form on the surface. I mean, do you agree with that? Hard for an animal to come out of the ocean and then live on the surface. Because for the animal to do it, it needs to have food in the ocean and then food on the surface. But if you have plants, that's the food for the animal, right? So it makes sense that the plants come first. So there's when you look at the way the earth was created, it starts as dust, the water settles, plant life becomes created by the hand of God. And then you've got all these little single cell organisms, like some guy might go in the water and look at them under a microscope and see all these single celled organisms. And of course, nobody's going to believe them. And what will happen is certain organisms have an advantage to growth. And then as they grow into a bigger organism, you're only going to have fish so big. It's not like you're going to have something the size of a bus. Okay, maybe you will. So the bigger fish has to eat the smaller fish has to eat the plants, etc. On land, you got to have the same thing. You've got birds, you've got insects, you've got humans, mammals, whatever. The bird's pretty easy because the bird just eats seeds. The bird just eats something that came from a plant. Pretty easy for the bird to get around and survive. Bird eats tiny worms, tiny insects, etc. They don't have a big demand. They don't go around eating cows. So it's easier for a bird to develop earlier in Earth's history than somebody like Michael Moore or the average person who consumes a lot of food and drink. So what will happen is you got to go to the lowest life form, single-celled organisms. I don't want to make fun of anybody. Just insert single-cell organism. I'm thinking about a show that has a certain view. So go to the smaller organisms like insects and worms and things like that. You know what you need to help a worm survive? You just throw them on the ground. Problem solved. Not so true with a turtle. Turtle needs to drink water and eat plants and bite your finger or whatever. Worm has less demands, more likely to survive. So then you get up to the higher life forms, like the birds are going to eat the worms, and then the people are going to eat the birds. So when you think about something like, we're going to go colonize Mars, well, you know what's likely to happen? The first plant you're going to grow might be grass. Imagine that you can't even plant a tree because the likelihood of survival of a tree is a lot lower than a blade of grass. And then you might start terraforming by just planting grass everywhere. Same with under the ocean. And you can only really do it near the shore of the ocean on Mars, which is completely real. And then you say, what kind of animals? You're going to bring your dog and your cat? Well, the dogs and the cats are going to eat the other dogs and the cats. So they're going to eat the other animals, so maybe it's not such a good idea. You might want to start out with worms. You might want to start out with insects like ants that, eat leaves. Have a very low demand. And that's how you start out the growth of animal life forms on a planet. It's not like in the Precambrian period you just have an explosion of life forms and then it just grows into humans. That's not the way it is, or is it? So you start with the smallest life forms, and then you have to build up to the higher life forms. Humans cannot survive on other planets such as Terra or Phobos or Mars because they don't have the support system there. So you got to start out small. You got to start out clearing. And okay, so the point that I'm making is that in the history of the Earth on Wikipedia, it basically says the same thing. It says, there was dust everywhere and it settled, and then the water formed, and the animals, or maybe the plant life formed in the water, and then the fish, and then the animals that crawled onto the sea, which are the crustaceans, which you shouldn't eat because they carry a lot of parasites. That's the reason why. The fish swim around too quickly that the parasites don't attach to them. You would know that if you eat sushi. So animals move on to the planet, onto the earth. And the way I understand it, there's a turtle. He goes to the bottom of the sea and he grabs with his fist some land and he brings it up to the surface until it becomes the size of North America. So then what happens is you start to have organisms living on the earth, like worms and insects and birds, and then you start to have mammals. But what about, remember the dinosaurs? They were the large things like the pterodactyls and the tyrannosauruses and the bats, the giant bats. I don't remember what they're called, and the baby dragons. Only baby dragons could fly. That's definitely well known. So there could be other life forms that are beyond humans that we don't know about because we haven't gotten to that stage of evolution, and they will eat us is what's going to happen. So basically what I'm saying is I compared the 7 days of Genesis, which is exactly perfectly transcribed from the Hebrew and Greek Old Testament and Sumerian texts. It lined up perfectly with what Wikipedia said about the history of the earth, with the exception of man, because like man is the sixth day, on Wikipedia it placed man at kind of a different point. But I'm going to tell you, if you find the page like History of the Earth, you're going to be amazed by this. And look up Wikipedia. The page I saw was huge. It had this, I don't think this is it. It had like this line by line. This is everything that happened, dude. This is not the page, but you could probably look at eons. I'm sure you'll be able to find it if you look. There was a page that had everything that happened. It would have maybe it's geological time scale. And you go through and you read everything and you compare it to the Bible, Saint Jaime's Bible. And, no, he wasn't a saint. And what you will find is that it lines up with Genesis. Look at the point where it talks about water forming on the earth and the oceans forming and the dust floating around, and when how there was darkness and it went to light, and then the way the animals were formed lines up perfectly. Okay, so that's a little bit about creationism versus the other one, evolution. I mean, that's such a dumb argument. That's like saying starting versus continuing. They're two different things. Okay, so there is another timeline. The one I saw was a little bit more detailed than this. But that's how you know. If you have any questions or comments, please post below.